Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kevin Chilton, Explorer Chair of Space Warfighting Studies at the Mitchell Institute Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence, and welcome to our Schriever Spacepower Forum Series. We're pleased to have Congressman Jim Cooper, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces of the House Armed Services Committee, with us today. In that role, Congressman Cooper leads the bipartisan subcommittee responsible for oversight of our nation's nuclear and space forces. He's also one of the co-sponsors of the bill that established the United States Space Force in 2019. Congressman Cooper is also a member of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, the House Budget Committee, and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Welcome, Congressman Cooper, and thank you for making time to join us today on this forum series. And if you will, I'd like to kick things off by giving you the opportunity to give everyone some opening thoughts and remarks.
Thank you, General. I'm deeply honored to be with you, General Deptula, and everybody at the Mitchell Institute. I hope I can be of value today in my comments. First thing is the Biden budget on defense. It's actually pretty darn good. In fact, it's kind of amazing, particularly for a Democratic president. In the space area, it's $5 billion more than we had last year. In the nuclear area, which is also of vital importance, it's also dramatically increased. So President Biden gets it. It's a good, strong, pro-defense budget. And that's a little bit harder sometimes for Democratic presidents to produce than the other party. So that's the good news. Now, the question is how we're going to spend it. So Congress is fully engaged. I think we'll pass our budgets this year on time. This is an election year. It's already fraught politically. But I think that at least when it comes to money, the Defense Department is looking pretty darn good. Let me talk about space in particular. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but just a few years ago, really, we'd fallen into a period of extreme laxity. We were reliant for assured access to space, which is the mantra that we always had to say we were guaranteed. We were reliant on the Russian RD-180 rocket. Now think today in the Ukraine situation, what that would mean for us. Now it's true, you can buy a lot of them, put them in a warehouse, and maybe that gives you assured access to space, but we were almost completely reliant on their technology for a few decades there. And that is a critically dangerous situation for a superpower to be in. So fortunately, and thanks largely due to the whims of billionaires, we have not only weaned ourselves from the RD-180, we have established our own capability. And the most important thing economically is we've lowered the cost of launch by something like 85%. That's amazing. That was undreamed of when you were at Stratcom Commander. It's really a fantastic marshaling of the private market with government subsidies and the military know-how to get this job done. So that's extremely important. There are other things that we need to be thankful for. Way back in 2002, I think it was the Rumsfeld Commission report that warned us of a space Pearl Harbor. Well, that's a pretty dramatic warning. And what did Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld do about it? Immediately disband Space Command, like, give me a break. And when you were Stratcom Commander, it was under your purview. And it was General Hyten who woke us up when I became ranking and chair to say that as much as he loves space, he could never make it more than third or fourth priority. So we started looking into it, discovered that the Pentagon had 60 naysayers to disapprove any satellite, and hardly anyone who could give approval, even the SecDef. So that's a crazy situation, and it's actually one that I'm still worried about right now, that we may even have more naysayers today with the Space Force and Space Command than we did before it was stood up. So we've got to focus on things like that. I'm particularly concerned about speed of acquisition, and most important of all, quality of acquisition. As General Hyten again pointed out, we put up way too many big, fat, juicy targets in space. Their NRO did the same, but at least they did it a little bit more efficiently than the Air Force. And we got to have a resilient, survivable architecture that can meet all of our needs. Now, I always point out that one of the greatest gifts to the world in all of human history is the GPS system. Our satellites, which are miracles, and which were opened up, I think, after the Korean airliner was shot down. President Reagan opened up the architecture to the world. We didn't even think of charging for this absolutely vital, life-saving, military-enhancing service that is free and available to the entire world. But too many of our enemies and allies are trying to duplicate that service, and that makes our satellites more vulnerable. In fact, recently, one of our near-peer rivals threatened to have the capability to take out all of our GPS satellites at once. So we've got a lot to be alert to, a lot to be aware of. I'm thankful that Congress acted in time to wean us from the RD 180, to allow our space professionals to have their own service. And I kind of view myself as the guardian of the guardians, because I'm so proud of the Space Force being stood up. I'm so proud of Space Command. I think General Raymond, General Dickinson are doing an awesome job, but it's still in its infancy. And I'm worried about the Air Force trying to exert too much control, and in some cases to stifle the development of the Space Force, because I think the future is unlimited. We know that the universe is unlimited, and we have to have not only the best capability, but by far the best capability to make sure that we achieve our national goals, and really for the benefit of the entire planet. So thank you, General. I'm honored to be with you today. I hope I can be of use to your audience.
That's outstanding introductory remarks, Congressman, and you will certainly be long remembered as one of those who stood up to support the stand-up of the Space Force and reestablishment of U.S. Space Command. So thank you for that. You know, over the past several months, one of the comments you've reiterated numerous times in hearings is that the Space Force has to be tougher, faster, and bolder. And in some ways, the Space Force cannot be bold enough, I assume. But what areas do you see the Space Force needs to be more bold in, and where they need to make improvements to achieve the tougher, faster adjective that you described? Over.
Well, I would say that the first step is for the military to catch up with the private sector, because so much of the innovation has come from innovative small companies, sometimes in California, sometimes even in New Zealand. And it's amazing what they've come up with. But we really need to go beyond that. In the most vital areas of national security, we pride ourselves on being decades ahead of commercial development. But that really means having folks who could be billionaires sacrifice that lead technologically for the benefit of national security. And I hope we can find that in space. There are other things. There was a general, you and I both remember, General Quast, who was something of a renegade. He talked about cislunar space. And a lot of people didn't even know what he was talking about. But now the Chinese already have a base on the other side of the moon. We finally put the James Webb Telescope and the Lagrange point on the other side of the moon. But we are slow getting there. And we're slow thinking of the big things. NASA, in some ways, has been ahead of us scientifically. So we don't know what the future will hold, but we need to get there first, whatever it is. And I'm worried that we got too relaxed. We got too focused on the war on terror. That was important, but not as important as this strategic imperative of making sure that space benefits all mankind.
Thank you for that. If I could touch a little more on cislunar space and keeping track of what's going on between the Earth and the Moon and in lunar orbit and the Lagrange points, as you point out. Back when I was commander of Stratcom, we used to say if you really wanted to hide something in space, just put it in lunar orbit because no one's looking up there. And as you point out, the Chinese now have a presence on the lunar surface and a Lagrange point. U.S. Space Command has been given an area of responsibility starting at 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth and up, which would include cislunar space, of course. But the proximate threat seems to be to our orbiting or low Earth or Earth orbiting satellite constellations, whether they be in low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, or geosynchronous orbit. What are your thoughts on how the surveillance of the domain beyond geosynchronous out to cislunar, who ought to be doing that? What investments need to be made? And is there an opportunity to share that responsibility with an organization like NASA, who certainly has an interest in safe transit between the Earth and the Moon and for future habitation exploration plans they have for the surface of the Moon?
Well, cislunar is fun to think about, but it's still largely the realm of science fiction, and we need to work with whoever we can, NASA, you name it. And I'm hopeful that the Artemis Accords, for example, will help build an alliance, because that's really one of our great strategic strengths, is our ability to befriend the rest of the world and have them be on our side. So there are huge opportunities there, and the technology is dazzling. Right now it's hard for humans to go up there for any length of time. So we probably need to be practically more focused at LEO and MEO and GEO, things like that. But remember that the closer orbits are also more under threat from ASATs. And both Chinese and Russians have used ASAT capability to devastating effect, not only in the speed of their lethal attacks on satellites and so far their own satellites, but also the debris causing result of that, which could so pollute certain key orbits. Because remember, space is not unlimited. Space is infinite, but the most usable parts of space, like the Lagrange points, are somewhat, or in fact, dramatically limited. And once you launch 100 satellites on a single rocket, and once you have networks of, many companies are already applying for 30,000 satellite licenses at a time. Space is getting very crowded, and we all need to be improving our space situational awareness, because to be able to see things down to 10 centimeters in size probably isn't good enough when a fleck of paint at 17,000 miles an hour can be like a bullet. So in fact, 100 times faster than a bullet. So we've got to really realize the lethality of space. It is clearly the most inhospitable place anywhere for human behavior, and that is the same for our satellites.
So true. I can I can resonate with that comment about it, how inhospitable it is. Recently, the administration released their U.S. National Space Priorities Framework, which appears to focus the Space Force more on operating as an enabler and support force versus a deterrence and warfighting force capable of independent operations as stated in Title 10. I was wondering if you might share your thoughts on the National Space Priorities Framework. Do you see this as a shift in policy, or do you see it being in line with where the Congress is with regard to adjustments to Title 10?
Well, to be candid, I heard Secretary Kendall make those remarks at the Space Symposium in Colorado. They worried me at the time. They worry me now, because it could all be benign and benevolent. But with the history we have with the Air Force and the difficult birthing process of the Space Force, I'm worried. We need to make sure that the mother doesn't stifle the child here. One day, the Space Force will be fully independent. I look forward to that day. In the meantime, we need to make sure that old Air Force thinking, which was even resistant to drones and certainly wasn't fond of the Space Force, as you reminded me before the broadcast started, when you were a STRATCOM commander, you had space and cyber under your control. And now those have largely been removed. No service can do everything. And the Air Force has its handful with piloted aircraft and other duties. So we need to make sure that we are able to promote and develop our space professionals as they should have been. And the Air Force was not taking care of that. On so many generals lists, the space professionals may have had one or two spots, and 30 plus went to fighter jocks. So that's fine, but that's the old days. Today, drones and autonomous aircraft will probably rule the day, and space is absolutely essential for every human activity. So you can get into a lot of curious doctrinal disputes about whether space should be completely independent. Certainly, it's the infrastructure of infrastructure. Almost all human activity on Earth is dependent on space in one way or another, whether it's position, navigation, or timing. And sometimes we forget just the timing component. So it's absolutely vital that we have the technology and the research focus. And everyone's jealous of everyone else's budget. But this is a time for a Space Force to live up to its maximum potential for the good of the planet. As I mentioned with the GPS example, we are a benevolent power. We never even thought of charging. We probably wouldn't even have to have an income tax in America if we had a few penny charge on the number of billions of people who use GPS as a vital service every single day. And it's just one of those transformative moments in human history that the Air Force hasn't gotten sufficient credit for, but we should all be realizing the gift of mankind that the GPS system was.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Not to mention weather satellites, over the horizon communications for global communications, missile warning, and the other things that we enjoy the luxury of.
It's extraordinary. It's really transformed the way young people think, and that's a good thing. It's my understanding at the Air Force Academy, you're a distinguished graduate, that the top 100 graduates, most of them want to be in the Space Force. I think that's totally cool. I wish we had the capacity to take more.
I've seen it firsthand, the increase in enthusiasm and interest in studying astronautical engineering, for example, at the Air Force Academy. And there is I think they're having to turn people away. There's such a desire to join the Space Force. General Raymond told me recently that they can be selective in their choosing of who comes in, whether it be out of the service academies or ROTC or through the local recruiter, because they have so many applicants. So they really are getting a quality force built. So one of the key missions of the Department of Defense and the Space Force in particular is deterrence. And that requires our ability to both protect and defend our key national security assets from threats that we know exist from both China and Russia. But it also would suggest, given deterrence theory and history, that there needs to be a capability to hold their assets at risk as well, to let them know that they could not gain an advantage by attacking our assets with impunity. I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on what you think the Space Force should be doing, not only to get after the threats and that are posed against our current constellations, but also, if it's appropriate in your view, for us to be holding our adversaries' space capabilities at risk as well, for the purpose of deterring them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but just a few years ago, we'd let our deterrence capability in space go almost to zero, which is pretty sad. You know, my committee does both the nuclear and the space area, and in nuclear, we're all about deterrence all the time, every day, every second of every day. So it's kind of shocking that we let our space deterrence go almost to zero. Our near-peer rivals, Russia and China in particular, have not delayed their advanced work, and they have already accomplished things that we've let completely languish. For example, in the 70s, we were way ahead in hypersonics. And now the Chinese, with their fractional orbit capability and other things, even the Russians, which is, you know, a country with the economy the size of Italy's, have shown amazing advances because they've really focused on that. So we've got a lot of catch-up work to do to reestablish deterrence, to not have the big, fat, juicy targets that General Hyten talked about. And exquisite satellites are wonderful, but we also need other types of satellites, survivable, accessible, maybe disposable. CubeSats are awesome. We've got to do whatever it takes to have a superior capability. And that includes not only extraordinary defense, but also an offensive capability. That's not fun to talk about. A lot of it's highly classified. And where we can, we need to be declassifying things that can help spur commercial development. But we also need to be aware that we should only be funding the US R&D budget. We should not be also funding the Chinese R&D budget. And when they hack our subcontractors in particular, we are just giving them all of our know-how. That's something that we need to be increasingly alert to, because the threat is ubiquitous. And many of our good-hearted, excited technologists at the lower level don't have the funding. At the Space Symposium, I noted that hardly anyone talked about raising venture capital money just so that they could protect their own internal networks. But that's absolutely a vital component that the Pentagon needs to be policing better, because without that, as I say, we're funding the R&D budgets of our adversaries. So it's something we can do, but I'm worried because you know the lethargy and the bureaucratic inertia of the Pentagon better than anyone. It's a wonderful institution. We're still head and shoulders above other militaries, as we're seeing the disastrous performance of the Russian conscript army. But we've got to make sure that we're always challenging ourselves to be the best. And sometimes I worry that we get distracted or we rest on our laurels.
Thank you. If I could shift gears here to another topic that is in the area of discussion right now, is the concept of a Space National Guard. The administration doesn't seem to support continuing the kind of the historical relationship which was between Air Force Space Command when it was part of the Air Force and the National Guard. I was wondering where you stand on this issue as we go forward and how you see this debate developing on whether or not we should have a Space National Guard.
Well, General, we all know the political power of the National Guard, and the Guard is awesome and it's part of the integrated force. I think as we look at our military, we need to look at two things primarily. First, on budgets and programs, we need to look at the threat. We need to meet and beat the threat. And on manpower and resources, we've got to look at value added, what really works. And in highly technical areas like space, it's amazing what new personnel designs we should be able to come up with, because you might want to have active duty people who are part-time. Because if you're a smart software engineer out on the West Coast or have other unique skills, you might be able to be a weekend warrior. You might be able to contribute in lots of ways, maybe guard, maybe reserve, maybe active duty. We may need a whole new concept because a lot of these super smart people have long hair and tattoos and nose rings and all sorts of crazy stuff that isn't traditional military. But we need the best talent that the nation can offer, including lots of times first generation or immigrant talent, because half the successful companies in Silicon Valley are headed by new Americans. So I think instead of bringing up old terms like do we have the Guard and with the old relationship, we need to think about what really works and what really can give us that 10-year, 20-year leap over anything in the commercial market that our nation needs, that our Pentagon needs to really meet and beat any other threat and to reestablish deterrence.
So it sounds like you would approach this kind of from the bottom up and try to almost re-architect the way we recruit and retain and utilize personnel as guardians going forward, and a little less on the lines of traditional organizations.
Absolutely. And I've also stressed, I've long admired the Navy model for certain of their key jobs like naval reactors. It's a 6-8 year term. Missile defense is now a 5-year job. Some jobs, it's not punch your ticket, move on after 2 years. You learn the job right as you're about to leave it. That doesn't work. We need genuine expertise. And I don't know who the Hyman Rickover of the Space Force is going to be. Perhaps it's General Raymond, but we need that sort of zero defect, demand for excellence, quick acquisition, superb acquisition, reestablish deterrence approach. And I've long been an admirer of NRO because it's not perfect, but it did a whole lot better job than the Air Force for years. And it kind of serves as a control group. Now, they had the advantage until the mid-90s of being a secret organization. But in terms of their lack of hierarchy, their relatively quick decision-making, what they've launched, it's remarkable in comparison to the 10, 12-year cycle. And sometimes the utter failure, like we've had with GPS M codes, in 15 years after the satellites are launched, we can't even get ground stations to perform well with encrypted messaging. So there are several national embarrassments out there that we need to make sure do not happen again.
Earlier in our conversation, you talked about the importance of commercial space, and particularly for launch. And I'm sure you were alluding to SpaceX and the Falcon 9 and how that's put the U.S. back, not only in an affordable launch position, but it has allowed us to compete as a commercial launch provider and also in support of our military and national assets. So the partnership has been important for launch. I was wondering if you might comment on what you think the opportunities are with regard to our constellations on orbit and partnering with some of these commercial entities. And what I'm thinking of here is perhaps an analogy is the CRAF force that Air Mobility Command has with in their relationships with our major airlines. And in time of crisis, they have them essentially on retainer and can bring them in to support movement of armed forces personnel around the world with what are otherwise configured as commercial airliners. Your thoughts on that?
I wish everybody in uniform could go to the Space Symposium, and I wish that they could use their imaginations more, because one of my favorite definitions of leadership is it expands what you're allowed to think about. And with space, there are no limits. It's incredible the innovation that's currently underway. the innovation that we could currently be using with our Space Force and Air Force and other branches of the military. A lot of these concepts are highly technical, but some of them are just utterly amazing. If I had suggested 5 or 10 years ago, oh yeah, you can bring a rocket body back to Earth and it can nestle back on the launch pad without wings, or you just thought I was lying or kidding or dreaming or drunk or something. But it's happened. And one reason it's happened is because Elon Musk has been in terrible competition with Jeff Bezos and two of the richest people in the world. Their hobbies can be pretty productive sometimes. But we shouldn't have had to rely on their hobbies for us to benefit from their technological success. And, there are going to be a lot of failures. And sometimes in the Pentagon, people are failure adverse. I get so tired sometimes of generals wanting a preview of a hearing before we have the hearing, as if they're more afraid of me than they are of the enemy. Like, give me a break. In other committees in Congress, there is no witness preparation. And yet we get so accustomed to that with our military. It's almost like hand-holding or something, coddling. And I don't want to hurt anybody's career, but people should be able to answer questions like from a reporter off the cuff and do a good job. This is not as difficult as some people make it seem. So it's really a challenge, and we can meet and beat this challenge, but it's going to take new thinking. And sometimes we think too much in the old ways. Like, it would be a disaster if Space Force becomes TRANSCOM. We've got to be much bolder than that. Space is its own warfighting domain. And it may be, we're already halfway toward robot wars already. It may be that the wars of the future are entirely robotic. And wouldn't that be a great blessing for mankind if it was just machine versus machine? And we could settle our disputes that way with minimum loss of human life. But see, I'm worried that people aren't so much thinking in those terms. In fact, if you take a hard reading of Secretary Kendall's speech, it's all whether our troops on the ground are benefited. I've written an article already for War on the Rocks, pointing out that if we reflexively attack ground stations, anytime one of our satellites is attacked, that is needless and heedless escalation of war. These doctrines aren't developed yet, but we need to be thinking and planning and ready. And I'm worried that we're still not there yet. It's a lot to expect in a couple of years for Space Force to figure this out. General Raymond, General Dickinson at Space Command are doing a great job, but we got a lot of work to do. And we haven't caught up yet. And I hear a lot of vaporware. I hear a lot of nice plans, 5, 10, 20 years out. But we need the capability now. We need it yesterday. And I'm worried that we're not there yet.
It would certainly appear that we're in crisis mode. And the Space Force didn't have the advantage that the Air Force had of 20 plus years to plan and vision a future and then equip for it and then prove its theories in World War II before becoming a separate service. So as you point out, there's a lot of simultaneity here that has to go on, and it's a tough job. But thankfully, they're getting the talent on board that hopefully that will deliver on these things. If I could go, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Excuse me, General. We have had the 20 years. Look at General Schriever, well, the namesake for this program. He rescued the Air Force rocket program when our rockets were blowing up on the launch pad and nobody knew why. And he figured it out. Thank God he figured it out. And thank God there's a base named for him in Colorado. But see, we largely squandered that advantage. And it's not the military's fault. We had with NASA one of the greatest programs in all the human history, and we largely forgot about it. We didn't bother with it. We gave up on much of big science. And we wonder why there's so few STEM graduates and our employers are coveting STEM graduates. We gave up on big science. And now, thankfully, we're returning to it, because without a technological lead, our nation is doomed. And Space Force can help quicken the imagination so that we re-achieve our technological lead.
Indeed, I recall hearing Neil deGrasse Tyson say in a speech one time, we didn't need STEM programs in the 60s. We had Apollo. And to your point, that motivated, I know, people like myself. I grew up in that era to become engineers and scientists, et cetera. So, just we're witnessing here in the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, the Ukrainians using commercial satellites. The Starlink constellation has been in the press as being used to support them. That's kind of where I was going on my previous question. Do you see opportunities for commercial entities to support the Department of Defense and particularly the U.S. Space Command and their national security mission. And do you also see some areas that we need to be cautious about? Should we integrate them into plans or future concepts?
I'm thankful that Elon Musk gave 5,000 Starlink dishes to the people of Ukraine. Guess what? I bought a Starlink dish for my farm in Tennessee, because without that, I have no internet access at a farm in Tennessee. That's pathetic. The United States, forget the military, we have some of the most expensive, some of the slowest internet in the world. Why? We've had a lot of government programs to subsidize it, but the carriers have been slow rolling it out. Back in the New Deal days, we were able to electrify all of rural America in about 10 years using electric co-ops. It worked. We had to create a whole new delivery system to make sure that rural people got their fair share of electricity in this country. We haven't done that with the internet. So technologies like that are available. Elon Musk's engineering genius has made it accessible and affordable. It's remarkable. It's not a perfect system, but it sure beats nothing. It sure beats dial-up. It sure beats the pitiful alternatives that we've had, because right now we can't even trust the FCC maps of where internet service is really provided in America. So we've got to get our act together, not just in the Pentagon, but in all the agencies. And one of the big points I want to make is this: we pat ourselves on the back when we get interagency cooperation. And in crisis times, we try a whole of government approach. Well, we are facing autocracies right now that routinely try to use whole of society approaches. And we have difficulty in our polarized times even imagining a group effort like that. So we've got to get our game on if we're going to continue to be the greatest power and the last hope of mankind.
Thank you. Could I shift back to some of your earlier comments on technological superiority? You pointed out how far ahead we were the rest of the world in hypersonic research, even back to the early 60s with the X-15 program that was operating with a person in it above Mach 6.5. And then we just kind of set that aside. And then it always seemed, as we talked about the potential use of hypersonics for the Department of Defense, I remember the mantra was always, well, it's always just 5 years away. And next year it was still 5 years away. And the next year was still 5 years away. From a technological maturity point of view, I always question if that's because we didn't put enough effort into it. But clearly now we're dusting off what the work we've done in the past to play catch up to both the Chinese and the Russians in this area where we used to lead. I want to ask you your thoughts on directed energy, because that seems to be another technology that is always 5 years away, or at least that was the mantra in the past. But we have also done some tremendous work in this area over the decades. Is it time to start looking at its utility for some of these missions in space to both defend our assets and also hold at risk our adversaries' assets? Is it time to invest more in the directed energy area so we don't get behind once again?
I love directed energy. It's wonderful to think of an unlimited magazine, but we all know it has some technical limits, at least so far, at least until our brilliant scientists figure out how to penetrate clouds or track as precisely as you need to burn through what you need to burn through. We've been enamored of other technologies. I love the railgun for a while. The ghost ships is great, but railgun didn't pan out like we thought. We need to do whatever works. And the key thing is sustained development and also testing. So often we think one test a year, we'll learn from our mistakes. Our rivals are testing, a couple of times a month. That takes budgets to do that, takes preparedness, but we need to fail again, fail better, as the playwright Samuel Beckett said. That's called progress. But so many people in a bureaucracy are afraid to fail at all. So we over-engineer, we gold plate, we delay, we hem and haw. Everybody's afraid to say yes and take full responsibility. So we can do this. We've done it, but we can't afford to get distracted again. And we need to somehow maintain our focus as we achieve the pure excellence that we're capable of.
And so, Congressman, what I'm hearing you say is we need to be willing to take more risk in our development programs. And you brought up General Schriever earlier. I think it was our 13th attempt at launching the first Corona satellite before we finally were able to take first pictures from space. So there was 12 failures of various causes, either the rocket or the satellite recovery system, whatever along the way, and yet they persisted. One might argue that part of the reason we've gotten so conservative is because the Congress is also intolerant of spending money and seeing it fail. I would posit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, if General Schriever were trying to do the Corona program in 2000 rather than the late 1950s, he'd have been hard pressed to get additional funding after the first failure, never mind the 12th. Your thoughts on Congress's role in incentivizing more risk taking, particularly in the development phase of a program?
Well, General, no one is going to be more critical of Congress than I am. It is a severely defective institution. But as I mentioned with the Biden budgets, right now we have billions more for all these programs to pursue. And it helps us a great deal if the Pentagon requests additional funding. But so often we weren't even getting the requests. I'm worried it's not just at the top level of budgeting, but it's also within the organization. When I visited some of our defense facilities, I'm hearing that subject matter experts, SMEs, are no longer valued like they used to be. That used to be a position of prestige and honor, and many of them are leaving the military as DoD civilians to enter the private sector, not just to make a little bit more money, but because their work they felt in the Pentagon really wasn't honored. And if we lose our subject matter experts, and in some cases, we haven't even retained the knowledge that we once had. This is a shocking development when we rely on individuals and we haven't even videotaped their expertise, because there's an artistry, there's a craft to everything that's done. And so we've got to make sure that we haven't allowed our infrastructure to decay. It used to be that Air Force colonels would so fall in love with the project, they didn't even want to be promoted because they wanted to stay with it. But now everyone seems hell-bent on promotion. And it's great to be a general officer, but what we really need is the best. And we need to incentivize the best, whatever it takes. And if you want to be the best darn colonel in the world and keep at that position for 20 years, that's fine with me, as long as you're producing value.
There's a role for, I would suggest, for our senior executive service, SESs and GS workforce as well, which has always been a major part of the acquisition force in both space and air. Your thoughts on their professional development, retention, and how they can participate in this as well?
It takes a team, it takes a village, and I'm happy with detailed private sector executives, because some of our most capable people are a little bit afraid to be fully SES or government, but their part-time expertise. It was Henry Kaiser who helped us build ships in San Francisco, and he's turning them out like a couple a week. It's amazing what can happen. AT&T, you're at Sandia right now. They used to lease Sandia for $1 a year. Like, it's amazing what can happen. But the talent spotting, talent keeping is probably the most vital function of the Pentagon. And different services do it in different ways. Different activities appeal, but it's job one if we're going to meet and beat any threat.
Well, Congressman, you mentioned that you're a harsh critic of your own body on occasion. Is there anything that you think that the legislative branch of our government could do differently to help get at some of these issues that you've articulated that are challenges we need to overcome?
Well, one of the biggest issues is overall budgeting, and that's a gloomy topic. Nobody likes the dismal science of economics, but where's all this money coming from? No American volunteers to pay more taxes. Most everyone wants more services, and there's been a structural gap there for many decades. We haven't run a real budget surplus since the last 3 years of the Clinton administration in the 90s. We seem incapable of even imagining that we could do that again. So pretty soon the fastest growing part of federal government won't be any productive program. It will be debt service on our national debt. And much of that is held by foreigners. So this is a trap we've dug ourselves into. with unreasonably low interest rates for a decade or more. We all thought that was the new normal. It was not. Now that interest rates are returning to normal, people are screaming bloody murder, the stock market goes down, but that's called normal. And for those of us who survived the Carter and Reagan administrations when interest rates were 13, 14%, we're in a very friendly environment today, even with the higher rates. But people get so accustomed to 2 or 3% car loans or mortgages, they think that should always be the case. I wish money were free. It is not. It will never be free. It's an illusion. And if we're going to budget for the military, we've got to wake up to these economic realities.
So we have to consider inflation when we budget for the military to make sure they get the structure they need.
Inflation is a hidden tax, but we also need to figure out how to pay for these programs. And we need to remember that the only part of the budget we don't set is the military budget because it's threat-based. Our adversaries are making us spend more money. And we as patriotic Americans should be willing to pay whatever it takes for whatever program, whatever testing pace we need to have to meet and beat the threat. But that also means efficiency. And, people are always worried about waste, fraud and abuse in military spending. But most of it is properly and well spent. But there have been some egregious examples that have dampened the taxpayers' enthusiasm. So as I say, anything is possible with a military budget. If it's worth it, we're going to pay for it. But we got to make sure it's worth it.
Well, thank you, Congressman. And before we go to question and answer, I want to thank you for your service in the Congress and as chairman of this really important committee. And if I could share my own experience, it was an incredibly bipartisan body. When I had the privilege to testify before, it didn't matter which side of the aisle was it chairing at the time. It was all about doing the right thing for national security and for the interests of our people. And thank you for your service in this role as the chairman of the strategic subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee.
Very kind, General. The House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee have been two of the most bipartisan parts of Congress, and I'm thankful for that and hope it will always continue.
I do as well. And now I'm going to ask my colleague Dan Rice if he would help us with the Q&A section of the forum today. And Dan has been tracking the texts and questions that have been coming in. So over to you, Dan.
Yes, sir. So I would ask that if any of our viewers right now have a question, you can use the raise hand function to raise your hand, and I will call on you so that you can ask your question. But first, I've got a couple written questions to turn to. So this one comes from Colt Simmons, and he asks, since 1947, to build up national and community support for over 435 congressional districts for USAF missions, the USAF over time embraced the Air National Guard and the voters in those districts. It appears now active duty U.S. Space Force leaders are not learning the lessons of congressional and community support for a Space Guard by disallowing formation of a Space Guard. Those of us working in and supporting the U.S. congressional community would appreciate your perspective and comments.
I mentioned earlier the political power of the Guard is immense, and it performs a super valuable service, but space is pretty technical. And when we have a shortage of STEM graduates anywhere, we need to make sure that the Space Force, which is pretty heavily STEM developed, is able to attract those folks, because it's all about value added. If you're a guardsman in whatever state and you can really make the Space Force better and stronger, awesome. We should figure out a way to make you part of that service, and regardless of the title, because it really doesn't matter to me whether you're active duty, Guard, or Reserve. What matters is whether you're helping America. And we think in these old-fashioned bureaucratic terms. They may have worked great in 1947. This is 2022, and we've got to up our game so that we are drawing on the talents of all Americans and not just looking for folks who want to be what they think of as, a part-time or weekend warriors.
All right, the next question we've got is from Chris Shank, who says, as we've seen with the conflict in Ukraine, commercial imagery satellites can provide significant military and intelligence value by providing transparency to Russian aggression and possible war crimes. Further, this insightful intelligence is unclassified and shareable to partners and allies. What are your thoughts on this revolution in national security affairs?
It's fantastic. Thomas Friedman, the columnist, has called this World War Wired, because literally everyone on the planet can tune in and be horrified by what's happening. And the world doesn't necessarily have a vote, but they have strong opinions. And it's done more to shore up NATO. It's even gotten Switzerland off of the bench. It's stunning. Germany's now actually having a real military budget for a while. You know, it's extraordinary what's happening. Sweden and Finland may join NATO. This is, you know, an incredibly powerful thing. Commercially available satellite imagery. But there are other technological leaps that are just fantastic. I'm fond of the company Relativity Space that can 3D print a rocket. Who even knew that you could metallic print something, 16 feet in diameter with greater structural strength? It's extraordinary what's out there. And that's why I encouraged everyone already to go to the Space Symposium, because you not only see the imagery advances, but advances in so many other areas that might seem irrelevant today, but could be of vital importance tomorrow.
Our next question comes from Professor Bonnie J. Dunbar from Texas A&M University, Aerospace and Engineering Department. So she says, we have a number of SME faculty who have formed a Space Force group supporting the Air Force and our hypersonic research. We also have expertise in SDA and other topics. How can we best help and connect our expertise to the Air Force?
Well, Aggies don't need any lesson of how to connect militarily. You know? Y'all are one of the most connected, but I like your advertisement for your capability, and Aggies are awesome. So, but we need all the universities in America, including Texas A&M, to make sure that we have the world-beating capability and really world helping capability, because almost all the world is peaceful. There are a few nations that are uppity and angry. Hopefully the nations of the world, including the non-aligned nations like India, Brazil, places like that, will get off the bench and even go with Switzerland and say, hey, we want freedom. We want opportunity for our people. We want what America has to offer better than any other nation on earth or in the history of the world. And we need to see technological advances, not as so much weapons systems, but world improvement. Because, you know, we years ago changed the name of our Department of War, Secretary of War, to Department of Defense. We're primarily a defensive capability. We primarily rely on deterrence to help the world. And that has worked pretty darn well for many, many decades. We need to make sure that we don't fall down on the job, and Texas A&M can certainly help us do that.
Our next question is from Emily Stewart. With Netflix's Space Force series combined with most strategic communication about the Space Force and U.S. Spacecom writings confined to esoteric publications, what is the best way to educate and inform the American public on the necessity of defending the space domain?
Well, Space Force certainly has been open to ridicule. I blanched when President Donald Trump saw it as a new shiny object and really didn't know much what he was talking about, but he was excited. But that helped us get it through some Senate votes that we were otherwise unable to get. The technical side is largely confined, and we could open up some of that. Space situational awareness is probably one of the most important things we can liberate. It's supposed to be in the Department of Commerce already. It's supposed to be the air traffic controller for the world. We've been slow transferring that capability. Now, the military always needs to have even better capability, but we should have done this years ago. We are the trusted source for the world. Even our near-peer rivals trust when we say their satellites are endangered or when their rocket bodies are falling, who knows where on Earth. But we've got to improve that capability. And it's not what it should be. Some private commercial companies are leapfrogging us. They are, buying locations around the world that help better than our Air Force or Space Force have been able to do to track things. We need world-class capability in this regard. And this is one of the many areas we've let our capabilities languish.
This one comes from an anonymous attendee. and it is, what is your thoughts of the addition of nuclear thermal propulsion as a defensive measure to protect and defend satellite systems?
I'm technology agnostic. I want whatever works. And we know that we can keep nuclear safe. It's not, people shouldn't get hyperventilated about it. When properly done, as it's done on every one of our nuclear powered submarines and aircraft carriers, there's no risk at all. What is a problem is when you take it for granted or treat it routinely or carelessly, and then it's a problem. But whether you use, polonium or something exotic to have a perpetual propulsion in space, it's not a problem. It shouldn't be an issue.
And I've got one here from William Sorensen, and there was a couple questions kind of related to this. So his question is, with the administration banning ASAT operations testing, what are your thoughts on cyber counterspace as a legitimate avenue to hold adversary assets at risk?
Oh, cyber is amazing, and no one really knows the dimensions of it. I am thankful that in the Ukrainian conflict, the Russians have not been 10 feet tall as we'd feared. And we've been able to harness, all these hackers around the world to help, leverage their capabilities to get inside the Russian defense establishment. So that's great. And that shows again how our allies are our greatest strategic strength. It's our friends around the world because they have immense capabilities and we're stronger together. And that's a very powerful thing. So cyber is awesome. Its dimensions are still being understood. And as new chips are developed, that will change. As quantum comes, which is really the path-breaking thing in which we must be first in, that will completely change everything that we can imagine. It's like AI. Those are the two major transformative technologies that we need to get on board with. And that's AI in particular is going to make these robot wars much more feasible. So hopefully we can minimize human casualties.
Our next question is from another anonymous attendee, and it is, earlier you said that you think things are too classified and things need to be more declassified in order to have deterrent effect. What do you think, or why do you think it's taking so long to review the programs for declassification, and what can Congress do to expedite this process?
Here's where bureaucracy kills us. We have trouble even hiring people. The delays just to join our intel community are staggering. It can be a year or more wait. Meanwhile, these hot prospects are being offered great jobs in private companies and able to start work, make a lot of money. We cannot allow our own bureaucracy to strangle us. Part of it is there are very few people who have sufficient clearance to really know what's doable and not doable. Everyone's scared of their own shadow. It's a risk-averse culture. I sometimes call it the bank teller mentality. That's when you get punished. If your teller's long and short is not right at the end of the day, but if you make the most brilliant loan in the world, you won't necessarily be rewarded. So that's the trouble with bureaucracy. And civil service reform should be one of our top priorities. It's a difficult issue because humans are not robots. Humans deserve all kinds of help and protections. But the overall teamwork of the Pentagon's got to work better than it's working today.
Our next question is from Shay DeLutis, and it is, Ellen Lord testified recently that the defense industrial base was limited in providing innovation due to government personnel reluctance to utilize the authorities provided by Congress and the FAR. What can be done to encourage and support these individuals to embrace all of the authorities Congress and the FAR have provided?
Well, we're at a point now in our country's history. We're an aging empire, and we have so many laws that it's difficult even to read them. General Hyten went back and looked at his authorities, and he was kind of amazed at what he had. And he has a special vantage point, having been head of StratCom and vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But some of the laws are so darn complicated and out of date, and you could put the Defense Department 5,000 acquisition regulations in that category, that we've had to bypass them so many times. There's almost not enough law left to know where the loopholes are. I think every Secretary of Defense has pioneered some sort of acquisition improvement study since 1947. And yet we still seem to be slow, certainly behind the capabilities of our near-peer rivals. So this can be solved. It's not going to be solved overnight, but it takes men and women of goodwill and energy and insight to figure out ways to get it done. Budgets are sometimes an obstacle, but oftentimes it's our own red tape. Let's reduce that red tape. I've long advocated that Congress have a spring cleaning. Why don't we repeal half the laws, especially the stupid ones? But see, we oftentimes don't know our jurisdictions well enough to know which laws are obsolete or old, out of date. So our capabilities as a nation are unlimited, but we've got to focus. And so many of my colleagues are just focused on reelection or getting on TV every night and not doing their homework. And the work of government is sometimes boring, it's sometimes dull, but the most important thing we probably need to do is have a new age of recruitment, because it's my understanding when John F. Kennedy was president, some of the ablest people in America wanted to work for the federal government. They wanted to move to Washington or wherever the federal government was located. They wanted to do a good job. And oftentimes since then, we've not been able to recruit the best and the brightest of a generation to come to Washington. I'm prejudiced, but too many of our best people have gone to Wall Street. Too many people are in finance, hedge funds. That seems to be where the money is. And they're not necessarily making our country stronger as they do that.
Well, Congressman Cooper, I'd like to use the host's privilege here and bring us to a close here with perhaps a bit of gratitude and give you opportunity for some closing remarks. Again, I want to thank you for your leadership. You mentioned General Schriever was thinking about this in the late 50s. Indeed, he was, but we had policies in place since 1982 when Air Force Space Command stood up, which prevented us as leaders and even as junior officers to talk about space as a warfighting domain. And I think every military person knew that at some point that was going to happen. But we lived in a hopeful world, forgetting that our adversaries get a vote. And they certainly voted in 2007 when the Chinese tested their Asat capability. The Russians put an exclamation point on that recently. But it's only been since the last year of President Obama's administration where we've unleashed even the minds of our current guardians to start doing the hard work to write down requirements and what needs to be done and funded to develop a true warfighting capability that will do exactly what you said, and that is deter conflict. And I reflect on the fact that the Space Force is just over 2 years old, and they've accomplished so much, but in history, oftentimes after one swing of the hammer, we think the nail's driven in all the way. And it's your leadership that continues to, and your committees that continues to keep the focus on the need to continue to advance the ball forward in this domain, because as you've so well articulated, we're behind and there's a lot of work to do and a lot of changes required to accelerate that work. So again, thank you for your leadership, for your committee's leadership. And I would also like to then just close by giving you closing remarks here for the last few minutes of our session today.
Well, thank you, General. I appreciate your kindness. And it's not about me. What matters is whether our nation is always the strongest on earth and by a large margin. We don't want to be close. And I hate it when we let that slip, especially when it's due to parochial reasons. Congress can be faulted, the Pentagon can be faulted, services can be faulted, but what matters is learning from our mistakes and doing a better job next time. And hopefully we'll do it quickly and without recrimination, but make sure that, for example, one of the things that worried me most was the Space and Missile Command in LA. So many of the billets were unfilled from lieutenant through colonel, because there was a bad school system there and servicemen and women did not want to be located in an area with a bad school system. So that one small thing of a bad school system gummed up the works of attracting some of the best volunteers in American history who wanted to serve, but didn't want their kids to be hurt during that service. So sometimes you need to look for the small things. Sometimes it's the big things, but no nation in the history of the world has been as great as we are. and we've inherited this legacy. It should be pretty easy to keep us strong. And that's our job, to keep us strong. I think we're doing it now, but let's do it better, faster, bolder, tougher, and then I'll sleep better at night.
Thank you, Congressman. And I want to thank our audience today for joining us, for their participation. And I want to wish you and the entire group that's joined us today my very best from MI Space here, and wish you a great future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.